Grace was the biggest score improvement I've ever seen. She went from a 255 to a 655.
Quinn went from a 350 to a 710.
Ethan went from a 535 to 635, which maybe isn't so impressive, but from a 69 to an 82 on quant.
Randy went from a 505 to a 705.
Nora went from a 530 to a 740 on the old version of the GMAT.
Michelle went from a 420 to a 690, but the really big thing was she went from first percentile to 90th percentile on verbal. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the GMAT Ninja Podcast, a collaboration between GMAT Ninja and GMAT Club. Today, we're going to talk about the craziest GMAT stories we've ever seen, the biggest, most eye-catching score improvements. Here for this conversation is Brian Prestia, founder of Reason Test Prep. Now, before I get into this, really important thing, we've both picked three of the biggest score improvements we've ever seen. We have not discussed these ahead of time with each other. So what you're about to watch is Brian and I in real time, two guys have been tutoring for 20 years plus each, discussing some students, poking holes in it, figuring out what the takeaways are from each student's story and which things are kind of so unique to that student it might not help you. So in the end, we'll kind of get to some conclusions about all of it, but I can promise you, not pre-scripted. We're learning about this in real time and springing these stories on each other without knowing about them in advance. All right, Brian, with that, go ahead and tell us about your first student.
Yeah, so Grace is the student who went from a 255 to a 655. And
maybe a dumb question, Brian, but did you talk to her before you saw the details of the practice test? Like when you first talked to her about doing tutoring, did you just have the number or did you see that she'd already omitted a bunch of questions?
Yeah, so I think I only knew the number at that point and had not yet seen the practice test. So yeah, I mean, I was pretty shocked.
What do you even say to her? I have a 255. I want to go to Harvard. Hey, Brian Prestia from Reason Test Prep, please help me. Like, what do you even? I know you're a really nice guy. I've known you for a long time, but like, how do you gently? How did you go about it? Like gently saying that sounds delusional.
Yeah. So I mean, I typically am very careful about what I tell people about what score improvement I think they might get, because as you can be very surprised by people. Some people have a huge improvement and you don't expect it. Other people, you're expecting a huge improvement and it doesn't really happen. So, I've done this long enough to know that kind of anything can happen. So, I mean, I made sure she knew that it was a huge climb, which I don't think she understood really how low that score was to begin with. Her, initial practice test was so low because of the penalty for not finishing questions on the section. So, initial reaction to the 255 is, oh man, we have a big project ahead of us here. But, when I took a look at her practice test and I saw how many questions she left blank, I mean, between 5 and 10 questions on every single section, I realized that the score was just, artificially low because of how many questions she had left unanswered. And so, it was a huge improvement, but, part of it was because the 255 that she had was really sort of not a real reflection of what she was, actually capable of. Maybe that pivots us into the take, one of the main takeaways here is that I think people don't understand how punishing the penalty is for leaving questions unanswered. And so, I guess there's a couple of takeaways from that. I mean, one is when you take an initial practice test, if you ended up leaving questions unanswered, your score is going to be kind of artificially low, and you shouldn't panic and assume that, it's not possible to get a really great score. And, obviously when you're at the end of the process and preparing to actually take the test, you need to really, you need to learn how to manage your time properly so that you're just not even risking leaving questions unanswered. Because, I mean, honestly, even like one question unanswered is enough to just bring the score down in a way that, leaves you with a score that's not what you're capable of. So.
And back the napkin, for those of you who aren't familiar with the scoring system on the current version of the GMAT, roughly, you're going to lose about 3 or 4 points on an individual section just for omitting one question. And that translates to about 20 points on your composite. So if you omit, let's say, 5 questions across the exam, it's going to cost you roughly 100 points, give or take. That's not super precise, but that's, I think, the best rule of thumb we can come up with.
Yeah, it's huge. And it should just never, it should never happen. I mean, people just, I think, don't understand, right? They think, well, like, what's the difference if I leave it blank or put in an answer? But I mean, under no circumstances should you leave questions unanswered. You should make sure, if you're running out of time, that you're putting in answers. And, ideally, you're learning how to manage your time such that you're not in a situation where you have 1 minute and 4 questions left, right? There is a way to learn how to manage your time so that you are not in that position in the first place. Obviously, it means that you might have to make guesses and be fast on questions earlier in the section, but that's part of what needs to happen for most people anyway.
So this crazy 400-point improvement for Grace, how long did this take total?
So it took about 5 months. But, and this is maybe we can pivot to what's less replicable about her experience is that, she was not working full time. Can't remember if she was fully sort of unemployed or between jobs, or maybe had very, very flexible schedule where she could basically throw as much time as she wanted to at this. And she was probably throwing, 20 to 30 hours of prep a week. So yeah, it was about 5 months, but for someone who's got a full-time job, maybe that would be much longer. So I'd say that's one aspect of this that's maybe less replicable.
Before we get to the full takeaways, Brian, let me ask you for some speculation here. And I know this can't possibly be precise, but when she walked in the door, so she traveled 400 points between when she started talking to you and when she took her test in 5 months. Amazing. Yeah. Where do you think her score would have been in the beginning if she'd managed her time properly and hadn't omitted anything? Was she about a 500 level skill person, 550, 600, 400? Yeah. Where do you think she was roughly?
That's a great question. So, this is the other part. Again, you and I bantering about this. I think you're going to agree with me on this. But obviously, some people just have have superior reasoning ability and superior problem solving ability, and those are maybe skills that are a little bit harder to build up and a little bit more innate in some people. So I think she was, a very smart person and, had very good reasoning ability, but she also just didn't know anything really about the test. And again, this is maybe where we get into what's maybe a little bit more unique about her situation. Obviously if you've done a ton of prep already and then take a practice test, you should expect a slightly higher score. So her initial baseline was, driven down partly by by omitting questions, so many questions, but also by just not really knowing much about the GMAT to begin with. So, I think it still would have been pretty low because I just don't think she really understood how to do much on the test. So, it probably would have been high 400s would be my guess. But again, she had the potential obviously to score much higher. She just was going in as a pretty blank slate.
Okay, so takeaways for anybody listening who wants 400 points. Everybody wants 400-point improvement. Don't omit anything. Learn to manage your time well so you don't get sucked into the vortex of a couple questions. And anything else that you think is specifically actionable for most people? Clear takeaways?
No, I think those are the two main things. Yeah.
And things that were unique to her. It sounds like you're saying, all right, we've got the fact that she had maybe not unlimited, but tons of time to study, could devote 20 or 30 hours a week without costing her sleep. And just she was so new to it that she was such a blank slate and you were teaching her everything kind of from scratch, which there's more to improve on. So more scope for improvement quickly. That might not be something that applies to everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. And, secret of a tutor is, when you meet someone who's like that, it's always like a little bit more like, okay, I got a blank slate here. There's so much that you could teach them. And it's much harder when you get someone who's done, a year of prep already and stuck, at a 645 and trying to get to a 675. So yeah, I think that's the other unique part of it.
So my student Quinn years ago improved from a 350 to a 710. And this is on the old version of the GMAT. Composite scores look different, but same general idea, 360 points. I'd love to say it was an amazing tutor. We worked together for maybe 3 or 4 months and worked on all the usual things where it's, hey, we're working on your process for approaching verbal questions and how to not make careless mistakes on quant. And then we're working on quant content and how to reason, all those great things. And some of those things needed improvement for him. And he was kind of like your student Grace, where he was really raw with a lot of that stuff, just wasn't a very savvy test taker yet. So a lot of improvement pretty quickly. So in that 3 or 4 months, he went from his 350 up to around a 650, let's say. And then his budget ran out and he kind of wandered off and we kept in touch. Really cool guy. Here's the thing. Most of the story was his English wasn't great. And he loved reading, but he wasn't very experienced reading in English. So he wandered off for about 9 months and we kept in touch. And he said, hey, I spend 2 hours a day reading good hard books in English. And then after a couple months, he said, you know what? I've fallen in love with doing these LSATs. So I do at least one LSAT set every day for reading comprehension or critical reasoning. And then he calls me back maybe 6 months after he started doing that. And he said, yeah, I just got a 710. I think I could do better. But he got 90th percentile on verbal. He underperformed a little bit on math. He was disappointed in his 710 because he thought he'd underperformed on quant. But I'd love to say there was more to it, but most of the story there was he was a guy who fell in love with the test and fell in love with the process of making his English better.
So, okay, so I have some questions here. So I guess first, this is getting into the minutia a little bit, but what kind of reading, I'm curious to know what kind of reading, because that's something we think about, at Reason Test Prep a lot of, recommending and, should it be fiction? Should it be nonfiction? Should it be books? Should it be short stories? Should it be economist articles? So, I mean, and maybe you can weigh in too with your own experience, not just with this one guy.
Yeah, good question. My feeling on it, and we've spent a lot of time kind of trying to dive into the question and reading some of the research on, well, what kind of reading is most efficient for building your fundamental reading skills? And the best answer is something that you enjoy enough that it's not complete torture, so you can keep doing it. 2, it's something that's hard enough that it's a stretch, but not so hard that you have to sit there and hug the dictionary the whole time. Ideally, a mix of fiction and nonfiction. Fiction kind of trains your brain to think more broadly and read things that are a little bit strange to you. You become better at reading nonfiction faster by reading fiction, say some of the studies. So everything good as long as it's challenging and as long as you can keep doing it. And this guy was reading everything. I mean, he was asking for recommendations for novels. He was reading Kafka and random, classic literature that he found challenging. I think he was picking up like science textbooks. He wasn't a science guy, but it was just like, oh, I'm going to try that. So he took it to an extreme.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'd say bottom line, anything that is challenging for you that you enjoy well enough and there's some variety in it, I think is healthy. I don't know if that's what you tell students typically.
Good question. The truth is that very few people want to read like that, right? Like, I mean, very few people want to spend time reading books and things like that. They really want to have a more directed, focused, okay, let me just do reading comp passages. So we actually have like a reading list that we've created, but it's mostly just based on recommendations of the tutors, our tutors, and what they think are great, challenging books. And some people are a little bit more, they have a preference for fiction. So their 8 books are mostly fiction, whereas I read almost no fiction. I don't even know any, I barely know any works of fiction. So all my recommendations would be nonfiction. But I wonder if, I hope we're not going too far astray here, but I wonder if doing LSAT passages as well was a good way to like anchor back to the format of a reading comp passage on the GMAT. You know what I mean? Like, if you're only reading books, but you've forgotten what a reading comp passage on the GMAT is like, it's probably good to punctuate that with LSAT or GRE or GMAT passages so that you're getting, tethered back to what it's actually like on the test.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think there are, I would think of it this way. I think we have run into students over the years, and by the way, fewer of them now than 10 or 15 years ago. I think most people kind of coming up into sort of MBA application phase of their lives now, a lot of people that kind of, grew up watching YouTube in English, and even if they're a non-native speaker, we see much higher levels of English comprehension than we used to from our non-native speakers. That said, we still run into students who really struggle to read well in English. And I think for somebody whose English is really far from what they need, if they don't enjoy doing the actual reading comp passages from the standardized tests, I would just say, okay, for some period of months, just focus on really getting your overall reading better and then come back to it. Because you might burn out. If you hate this stuff, you're going to burn out on it. This guy loved it. He started really enjoying the challenge of it.
Right.
And I think that's part of what made it work for him. Because it is such a long haul. If your reading skills aren't good, native speaker or not a native speaker, either way, it just takes time. Most of us have been reading, if you're applying for an MBA, you've probably started reading, 15, 20, maybe 30 years ago.
Right.
And if your skills aren't great, it's going to take you more than a couple of months to improve them. So it's a long haul. And I think whatever is sustainable for you is probably the best thing to do.
Yeah. I don't know if you want to comment on what's replicable and less so with this, but I guess I had one question, given that it was the old GMAT. To what extent do you think sentence correction improvement was a big factor here?
Yeah, I mean, for anybody, most people listening probably have no idea what sentence correction is. Old version of the GMAT pre-2024, there was a thing called sentence correction on the GMAT. It's a factor, but not a huge one. I think when you're talking about somebody that gets to that level where he ends up being 90th percentile plus, I mean, everything has to be really, really good. He wasn't disproportionately better on any particular question type. He went from tragic across the board to great across the board.
Yeah.
And the question types weren't really a big part of it for him in the end.
Yeah.
Takeaways, I think the biggest one is, if your issue is that you're struggling with reading comprehension, fundamentally, not reading comprehension, the question type, just comprehending the words on the page, deal with it head on. Don't necessarily try to just do GMAT stuff and just drill more GMAT problems if the underlying problem is a deeper skill. And I really appreciate the way that Quinn took this head on and said, hey, my reading sucks, so I'm going to go read a lot until I get better at it. That's the part that I think people can take away. The part that I think is harder to take away is his love and embrace of it and the amount of time he was willing to spend.
Right.
And that enjoyment of the process of learning how to read and reading random stuff, and this guy picking up textbooks and doing LSAT passages kind of for fun. It wasn't driven purely by, hey, I want my score as fast as I can. Like, he just took on the challenge of learning and was willing to take a long time doing it. And most of the stories where you see somebody's skills improved by 300 plus points, the actual skills improved, yeah, there's an element of, I want a higher score and I'm going to do GMAT things to improve it. But there's also an element of, I'm going to really dive into this and enjoy it. And I hope everybody listening can feel that way and enjoy studying for the test. That's also not realistic at all.
Right.
Brian, talk about your next student.
Okay. Yeah. So next student is the one who went 535 to 635 with, which that itself is not super impressive, but the quant, his quant score went from a 69 to an 82. So that was a pretty impressive jump. And I think this actually relates a little bit to what you were just saying about Quinn. And because I think, well, I guess let me just give a little bit of background. I mean, it was a pretty short timeline, actually. It was only probably 3 or 4 months, I think, all in. And he did have a full-time job. And, so he was juggling, preparing for the GMAT and doing, a pretty rigorous job. The thing that was really impressive about him was that he was, so I don't know if he had the same level of enjoyment exactly that it sounds like Quinn had, but he really just understood that. And there's something he said to me that I'll repeat in a second. But basically, he understood that, he just needed to do a lot of questions and get a lot of reps in order to really become kind of automatic with stuff. So, one thing I just want to caveat here, maybe this is just obvious, but you could do a million questions and do them terribly, and that's not going to be very helpful, right? Like, obviously, it's that is not, maybe it's necessary, but it's certainly not sufficient to just, rep out questions and do, a million GMAT questions. So he definitely, there was a lot of him understanding how to approach quant questions more effectively. And he also there was a lot of content he didn't know. I mean, he didn't understand how to, add exponents, and things like that. So there was a lot of content he didn't know. There was a lot of strategy he needed to learn about how to approach questions more effectively. But once he understood that, he then understood that he just needed to get a lot of reps in. And he said to me at one point that he had this experience in high school where he was competitive in a sport or something, and he would sometimes black out basically when performing. And so he learned that he needed to become so automatic with things that even if he blacked out, he would still perform well because it had become very automatic for him. And I'd never had anyone say that to me. I thought that was really interesting. And so I don't know if he got to the point where, doing GMAT questions was that automatic, but he did thousands of questions, and it was really remarkable. It was, miraculous is maybe a little bit strong, but this is another case where at the beginning, if he had asked me to predict where he was going to land on the quant section, there's no way I would have said 82. He was really weak. I mean, he's very, very weak at quant. And by the end, it was just amazing. I'd throw him a question and he would just, slice and dice it and do it pretty easily. And I was like, man, I can't believe you're this good at this now. So anyway, yeah, maybe not full love for it, but a real understanding of I'm happy to invest the time in this and really grind questions and make sure I can do things automatically.
So it sounds like it was an embrace, if not an enjoyment or a love, where he said, "Hey, this is what I need to do," and
Yeah.
didn't seem to mind doing it at the very least. Didn't burn him out.
Yeah, I think he had this understanding of himself based on this experience that he had in high school, that he just needed to do so much, hit enough questions that things became fairly automatic for him. Again, I don't know if he ever like was, I don't think you can be fully automatic on GMAT questions. I mean, you have to be thinking on your toes, and he didn't get an 87 quant. I mean, it was an 82. But he really did get to a point where I could reliably throw him questions and know that he was going to mostly know how to approach them. So it was, near miraculous.
So Brian, we said a minute ago about you were kind of getting at the difference a little bit between reps and good reps, because I don't want somebody listening to take away from this.
Right.
Oh, if I go do 4 hours a day of quant questions for 4 months, I can improve from a 69 to an 82. Right. And again, that 13 points might not sound like much. That is a huge, just the way the score scale works, that is huge. 82, you've got to be really, really good.
Yeah.
69, obviously not so good. So, I mean, massive, massive improvement. I mean, I think it is more than it sounds like. So I don't want people to think that it's just the reps. I know you don't either. And right. I know we talk about this kind of thing all the time privately, that it's not just volume. So how did you get him, or what did he understand, or what did you help him to understand about what the difference is between a good rep and a garbage rep that's not going to help him?
Yeah, I think there's two things there. One is, I think, just understanding how to be really effective in the way that you approach these questions, right? So, I mean, let's just imagine you do one question, right? I mean, in a tutoring session with me, or, he's doing it on his own, you're doing a single question, there are better and worse ways to approach that question. And some of that is dependent on the person, right? I mean, for one person, it might be algebraically might be the best way to do it. For another person, it might be making a strategic guess, right? So that's going to differ for each person, but there are better and worse ways to approach questions for each person. And so part of it is just understanding that, and understanding that most of these questions can be approached in multiple ways, and that you really do have to figure out and learn how to approach these questions effectively.
So that component is kind of the building the toolkit, right? So having different things in your belt, that might be different ways of approaching algebra. Might be some mechanical stuff, certainly, that it sounds like he needed to learn. It might be, sometimes the answer choices help you, or sometimes you can apply logic instead of doing algebra. I assume you mean that whole broad constellation of things that you can do to approach questions, and learning which ones to use when.
Yeah, and I think maybe just one thing on top of that is just like even understanding that there are all these options out there, and that there are, most questions can be approached in multiple ways. I don't know if this is your experience too, but I just find that many people, they just kind of think there's like one way to solve a question. There's like the textbook way to solve it, or there's one solution. So I think it's having that toolkit, but also just understanding that there's a variety of ways that most of these questions can be approached. And that's the fun of it, right? Like that's the game of it, of being really, clever and creative in the way that you approach questions. So I think that's one part of it. And then the second part, I guess I would just call it like very deliberate practice, right? There's garbage practice, and there's really, quality deliberate practice. And, I don't even think he was masterful at this, but I think he was very good at understanding that he should review question, one at a time. You don't do 30 questions and then be like, oh, how many did I get right? Right? That's just not that helpful. It's much more helpful to do one question and immediately reflect on it and be like, I got it right, but I spent 3.5 minutes. Why? Could I have done it better? Is there some other way I could have gone about it? Okay, I got that one wrong. Why? What does that tell me about myself and what I need to be doing differently? So I think, that's the other part of it, is obviously the practice has to be high quality practice. And it's not really, the quality is more important than the quantity ultimately.
Okay, so takeaways. What are the things that you think most test takers or many test takers could do that were things that worked for Ethan? Yeah,
I mean, I think you need to do really high quality practice, and you need to learn how to approach questions effectively. But you also there just is a certain quantity of material, a quantity of questions that you probably need to, a bar that you need to kind of surpass, where if you're just not seeing enough, you're not, you're either going to stumble when you see these things on the test, or just like actually not even know how to, forget how to do something or not know how to do it at all. So I think there is a certain, number of questions and hours of practice that you need to do on practice questions to really, to be getting a very high score. I think that's probably the main takeaway. Trying to think. I'm anticipating the what's not what's less useful here.
The other thing I might add in that sounds like Ethan did that I think is really good. So there's volume, there's the commitment to both quality and quantity. Good. It also sounds like there is an immersion sort of thing for him where he's like, hey, I'm going to do this. I'm going to focus on it. It's not necessarily reps over a long period of time. That same number of reps stretched out over 6 months or 9 months might not have done as much for him because he was trying to develop the kind of automaticness and develop his instincts. And I imagine that part of what worked for him is he was devoted to, I'm going to get in, I'm going to do this GMAT thing, I'm going to really concentrate on it several hours a day and get out instead of kind of coming and going. Yeah,
that's actually a good point. It helps, can't help but smiling here. It helps that he, started this in like October and was applying for round 2 and just had an end date, that he couldn't go past.
No pressure, buddy. Yeah,
exactly. So I think that probably helped him. But I think one point I didn't say and that I think you're hitting on is my opinion. I'm sure I have a feeling you're going to agree with this, is that like all other things equal, the more condensed the process, right? Like even if you're going to do the same, you're going to do 200 hours of prep, right? If that 200 hours happens in a shorter timeline versus a longer timeline, the shorter timeline, it just tends to be better because you're going to forget things, right? And, so stuff you covered, 3 months ago, you're like, I don't even remember this. Whereas if it's scrunched together in a much shorter timeline, that's better. So perhaps that's another takeaway for people, that if possible, like you said, the quicker you can get in and out, probably the better it is.
Do you think there's anything that's not replicable for other people here? I mean, it sounds like a lot of this is a story about discipline, commitment, doing things in a really good way, being committed to the quality of his reps, not just the quantity. But is there anything here that you think is really unique to Ethan that maybe other people couldn't pull that off?
I think it's probably like what you said about Quinn, right? Is that he had the motivation and understanding of himself that he just needed to put in a certain amount of effort. And he would go beyond what I would tell him to do. I'd be like, here's what I think you can do. He'd come back and have done, 100 questions instead of 30 or 40. So I think that's, I don't know if that's innate, but obviously not everyone's going to do that. So perhaps that's the unique part.
Okay. So my second student is a guy named Randy who went from a 505 to a 705. And part of what's really interesting about this guy is he has, I think, a couple of degrees in engineering. So obviously great quant training. His quant scores were not good. And his quant scores were not better than his verbal scores. It's not like verbal was the issue. I mean, he was kind of across the board pretty shaky. I think verbal was his highest score coming in. And he worked with one of our other tutors, Vlad. And Vlad started emailing me after the sessions and going, this is really weird. This is a guy with degrees in engineering, obviously great quant background, smart guy, really successful career. And he's making these really basic mistakes all over the place where he'll say something like, oh, x plus y times x plus y is 2x plus y. And just all of these really silly looking algebra mistakes. And it wasn't necessarily out of carelessness. Like he would do this and kind of defend it and then go, oh, wait a minute. Brian, I'm going to throw this at you and totally unfairly. What do you think was going
on? Probably some kind of learning difference. I mean, dyslexia or something like that would be my guess.
That was our guess too. And you're barking up the right tree because it turns out that this guy had pretty serious ADHD. Mm-hmm. And a lot of what was going on is there's ADHD fundamentally, people experience it in different ways, but there's so much different noise in his head as he's trying to do a problem. Right. That in essence, he would just kind of lose focus in a way on the details of what exactly he was looking at and misread it and think it was something else. So very, very long story short, over the course of about 8 or 9 months, so there was a lot going on. So some of that improvement from 505 to 705 was, okay, you could be more systematic, or here's some holes in certain parts of his math ability, or not great processes for approaching multi-source reasoning or whatever. Certainly there was some kind of, inside the GMAT, we're teaching the kind of stuff we typically teach in tutoring. Most of it, though, was really about, okay, let's deal with the ADHD head on. He'd already been diagnosed. He did get accommodation, so 50% extra time. But as much as anything, it was Vlad, I think, doing a really cool job working with him and saying, okay, how do we use that extra time the right way and build in checks? So when you look at something and start lunging at it, how do we get you to check your work every time, which sounds really silly, but it's how do we get you in the right rhythm? You're always reading the question twice. You're thinking before you jump in. You're checking every step as you go. Sort of develop a better inventory of here's the kinds of mistakes he would make. Here are the types of algebra where he'd kind of lose his focus. Right. Those are the things you double check, triple check if you have to. And really it was just kind of this slow grind of, yeah, some of it was improving on things that we typically need to improve on. But for him, it was mostly, right, we're going to get you extra time. Once you have that extra time, here's how you use it so that you catch those mistakes that you tend to make.
That's really interesting. I guess well, maybe you don't know because maybe Vlad knows better, but I guess how quickly did things improve for him once you guys kind of addressed the sort of the primary cause?
I'd say that the first couple of months there wasn't a whole lot of progress, and we were aware. We'd had the conversation about ADHD. We were aware of it, but the homework results were maybe slowly getting better on things that were maybe legit weaknesses. Things he didn't have a lot of experience on. Some of the data insights or certain quant topics that maybe he hadn't spent a lot of time on. If it wasn't relevant to engineering, he maybe hadn't done it in a while. So you saw kind of improvement on some of the skill type stuff or question types that weren't familiar, but it was a pretty slow grind at first. And then once they really started thinking in terms of, okay, the extra time is coming, once that had been granted and Vlad was able to sort of, talk to Randy in terms of, hey, here's how you're going to use this extra time that you're going to get. Right. And really start building in those extra kind of redundant processes in a way. That's when it's really started going up quickly. And he all of a sudden had practice tests where he was mid 600s, high 600s. And it was really kind of only after it was clear it was going to get the extra time. Obviously the extra time itself helped, but I think it was more around how to use it. So that was maybe 3, 4, 5 months in that they really kind of figured out the right formula for Randy in terms of how to think about it.
So I want to throw something out there that occurred to me as you were talking before. And you tell me if this sounds right, because I feel like this is a theme that's maybe running through a lot of these examples, is that, it sounds like with your guys' help, he was able, it almost sounds like you guys were kind of you were pointing him in the direction, but basically, he was able to have like a self-reflexive understanding, of himself, right? And so, because I think about like careless mistakes, right? Someone who's making just careless mistakes all over the place. Like you actually have to learn about yourself and why you're making those careless mistakes in order to know how to prevent them. And so, yeah, I don't know. It sounds like that was a big part of his journey, was just learning about himself and why he's having the trouble he's having. And then obviously with your guys' help, learning the corrections for that. And anyway, it strikes me that sounds like that's what we're talking about with a lot of these people, is like an ability to look inward and understand what they need.
I think 100% nailed it, Brian. I think that's so spot on. I think it's very, very easy to just kind of turn a blind eye to what's really going on and do what you're comfortable with as a student in any context. And we all do this in different areas of our life, right? I'm comfortable doing this thing that has always worked well for me, whatever it might be. And, for example, on quant, sometimes it's, well, hey, I can kind of memorize steps and I'm going to do fine on my university quant exams potentially. I don't have to be flexible. And I think Randy really took on the challenge of saying, wait a minute, I've been really frustrated, and he'd studied for months before he came to us, been really frustrated by the results that don't move. And he really took on the challenge of saying, okay, let me really think about why. And obviously, Vlad was there, and Vlad and I were talking a lot to kind of figure out what might help and brainstorming. But Vlad was there to kind of guide him. But a lot of students in that same situation would just say, no, that's not important. Teach me more probability. Teach me more combinations. I need to learn more math. That's what's going to do it. It really had nothing to do with any of his problems. It was just, I need to completely rewire the way I handle rhythm, pacing, checking when I take a test, and 100% about introspection, the willingness to see what was really there in himself.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that a lot of people, people who are getting tutoring or people who are just prepping on their own, there's a lot of just going through the motions, right? Where,
Yes.
they're just trying to kind of bang through a certain list of things, a certain number of questions and practice tests, and are missing the self-diagnosis part of it of, okay, let me try to understand what I'm doing wrong. I mean, I think that's the key to learning, right? Is being very good at understanding what the roadblocks are and figuring out how to overcome those roadblocks. So anyway, that's a huge improvement for someone who had already been prepping and been frustrated and only at a 505 to go to a 705. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah. So takeaways, I think the parts that can apply to, I think, most people listening. One is, yeah, don't run away from whatever the real problems are. We see people all the time who, I'll pick on ADHD. They'll say, "Oh, I have ADHD. I was diagnosed, but it's no big deal. I've learned to live with it." No, it changes your brain. It makes it really hard to sit there and focus on a multiple choice exam and not have those moments where the noise in your head makes it hard for you to answer the question correctly. It levels the playing field. It is more fair when you get accommodations so that you can take the time to do things the way you know how to do them. So the test is trying to measure your reasoning ability, not your ADHD. So the extra time used correctly can help the test measure you correctly in terms of your reasoning ability. So whatever the underlying condition is, whether it's something diagnosable like ADHD or dyslexia or anxiety or whatever, or just, oh, I have habit X and it undermines me, deal with it head on. I think most people who struggle on the exam, if they could just, in quotation marks, it's hard, if you can just do that, that's what unlocks everything. And I think that might be the through line in a lot of the stories we're telling. If you have something that entitles you to accommodations, please go get accommodations. Schools will never know. I think that's really important.
Yeah.
Obviously, the part that's unique is, Randy has his own unique brain and his own unique challenges with it and needed his own unique approach to making it better.
Yeah.
That might not apply to anybody listening. The exact things that he did might not work for anybody.
Right.
But you can dig into what's really going on in your head and figure out what's really going on and get somewhere if you really want to.
Yeah.
All right, Brian, third and final student.
Okay. So again, this is an interesting, juxtaposition because Nora is my final student. She went from a 530 to a 740, and it was a very big improvement. I think there's a lot of similarities here with Randy. So she also ended up getting accommodations. Her issue was test anxiety. It was and just psychology in general was her main roadblock. So I can give you some more details, but just the 10,000 foot view is she was also had an engineering background. She was actually an engineer, like a working engineer, and was very, very good at math, and good at verbal too. I mean, she was it was obvious that she should be capable of a high score, but she just kept getting practice test scores, and I think even actual GMAT scores of in the mid 500s. And yeah, I mean, she was an anxious mess, frankly. She was, even, the whole process was anxiety provoking for her. And when she would take practice tests and do time practice, she would, face just serious anxiety issues. And so, again, we can dig into the details. We had to, work on her mentality, but, part of it was also her getting accommodations for the severe test anxiety. And again, she's someone who really needed it, and it's hard to imagine how she functioned in life on standardized tests without it, really.
Yeah. So how did the anxiety manifest for her? What did you see trying to tutor her?
Well, I think there may be two ways you could think about it. One is just, again, like kind of a general level of anxiety of the whole process. So I don't know if you've had this experience, but it's very rare for someone to cry in a tutoring session. It's pretty upsetting when it happens. And, I've maybe only had it, I've done this for, 20 plus years, but I probably have only had it happen twice, maybe 2 or 3 times. And this was one of them. And she was just, just devastated by what she knew was her true ability and her inability to actually, manifest that on practice tests. And this was back, if you remember, the GMAT Focus used to be those like 24 question quizzes or whatever, and they would give you a score, and she had some very, very low score range, and I remember her crying about it. So part of it was just like the whole process was just rattling her, And then, when she was taking a practice test or some kind of time practice measure, like those GMAT focus quizzes, um, she would just, yeah, I mean, she would go blank on questions. And, one of the things that we had to work on, this is the part that might be helpful to people, is like, again, there's an introspection that needs to happen where you really have to understand what are the mechanics of what's happening to you, the obstacles that you're facing. And so this is a kind of unique, specific thing, but we uncovered that she had this view of percent questions, that they're easy. And so whenever she would see, because it's just percents, right? It's like not hard math. It's like the kind of math that most people actually do, as opposed to a lot of the other stuff, right? In real life, when you have to leave a tip, people are dealing with percent. So she would just look at every percent question and feel like she should be able to get it right, right? And so she put all this pressure on herself, like she couldn't get these questions wrong. But as you know, a lot of those word problem percent questions are just really hard, right? And they're misleading, right? And they look like they should be easy, but then they turn out to be very hard.
You could argue it's the whole joke of the GMAT, right? Is that things that look easy or sound easy, they can make anything easy. They can make anything hard.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, you could see something in the most, whatever you consider basic math, they can twist it into a nightmare.
Yeah. So she would never let go of those questions, right? And so even, believe it or not, even with the accommodations, she was still like running out of time, because she would spend 10 minutes on a percent question and, she'd be like frustrated. Why did I get it wrong? And I didn't really understand that was her mentality until it was just sort of an epiphany that happened in one of our meetings. And I was like, I had to kind of probe a little bit. And then she's like, yeah, like, I just feel like I should be getting this question right. And I was like, this is a like 800 level question. Like, no, you shouldn't really be able to get this right. I mean, this is above your level, actually. So that was just one of the things that happened. But kind of the broader theme is, again, introspection and really understanding the mentality, the sort of ineffective mentality that she often had, the assumptions she was bringing, kind of incorrect assumptions about the test, about the algorithm. Also, I can't get anything wrong in the beginning. That was another thing that she dealt with. I got to get the first 5 questions right. I'm like, okay, no. You're probably not going to get the first 5 questions right. So let's just leave that at the door. So it was a lot of having to disabuse her of these misconceptions that she had. And then, having the accommodations which she needed, that ultimately led her to this, pretty fantastic score, a 740 on the old test.
So I don't want anybody, well, tell me if this is wrong, Brian. I mean, what I hear in this story is, yeah, there's accommodations, there's extra time, but I don't think that's a magic bullet. If you are panicking and your brain is freaking out and there's all these thoughts coming in, you could have 3 times the amount of time and it's not necessarily going to help. So good to have the extra time because it gives her the chance to reset, take a breath when she needs to. The accommodations I think are useful, but they aren't going to fix it by itself. It sounds like what did fix it, or maybe fix is too strong of a word, did improve things for her enormously, was the ability to say, okay, I get anxious taking tests, crazy, intensely anxious taking a test. And we actually have an anxiety coach on our staff. I was talking to her yesterday about some of this. And one way she'll sometimes talk about test anxiety is it's distorted thoughts that are coming into your head when you're trying to focus. All of these things like, oh, well, this is easy, I should get this. Or if I don't do well on this question, it's one of the early ones, I'll get a bad score. And if I get a bad score, I won't get into Harvard. And then if I don't get into Harvard, my cat will hate me and he'll barf on my laundry again. And your head starts going crazy with stuff. And It sounds like she was able to, number one, start recognizing that her thoughts were distorted and change how she thought about things. And then it sounds like she was also just able to find a way to focus and not let those thoughts kind of dominate her mind when she was taking the test.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that's spot on. The one thing maybe I would add that I forgot to mention is she also started doing meditation. And awesome. I think that really helped her. Anyone who understands meditation should know where this is going, and anyone who doesn't is probably going to misperceive, what meditation does. But it's not like it stops the thoughts from coming. The spiraling thoughts like might still come into your mind, but she just got better at letting them go, basically, right? And kind of coming back to neutral in those times when she was previously kind of just spiraling kind of out of control. So yeah, I think exactly what you said. I think the meditation probably helped her in that.
So Brian, instead of doing takeaways for this student, I want to talk about my final student because they're very, very similar. And by the way, for anybody listening or watching, we didn't plan that. We didn't talk about these with each other really at all ahead of time. So we just sprung these on each other, react to it. My final student is very, very similar. We'll call her Michelle. She went from 420 and she brought that up to a 690. This was the old version of the GMAT. So I'll translate it a little bit into percentiles. So she went from first percentile on verbal to 90th. And when she first inquired for tutoring, we thought, wait a minute. The score was a 6. That was the raw score. So it was the equivalent to between a 60 and a 63 on the current version of the GMAT. And at the time, we looked at this and said, I have never seen a score this low. So at that point, I've been tutoring the GMAT for not quite 20 years, 15 years plus. And, we had 2 other tutors, one of whom had been doing it for about 5 years, the other one for about 15. Said, hey, what's the lowest verbal score you've ever seen? And we all said, I think the lowest I've seen is a 12. And, if you go take a practice test back then and you blindly guessed, you'd get a 12. And somehow she was doing worse. Literally, she was doing worse than blindly guessing.
Yeah.
And we thought, well, maybe her English is terrible. What's going on here? And, talked to her and it's like, no, she's a native speaker, articulate, seems like a really smart lady, has a great career, doing wonderfully. And I think where this punchline is going, that her anxiety was just so debilitating that not only would, all the things that you can experience, whether or not you feel consciously anxious, right? Like your mind's going blank, you can't read, all of a sudden this reading comp passage is in a different language, all of that. But it was to such a degree that it would kind of induce her to pick wrong, tempting answers disproportionately. Never seen anything quite that dramatic. And honestly, most of what happened was very similar to what you're describing, Brian, where, we're doing the things and trying to build good habits. Here's how to approach things. So you're doing things the same way every time on verbal. Great. That's great. But the bigger thing was her willingness to say, wait a minute. Yeah, there's really something going on here with the anxiety. She started doing mindfulness practice. So meditation, there are other things you can do to build mindfulness. That was the thing she took on. She basically said, oh, right, this is the thing. And she had a lot of those negative thoughts in her head, really worked hard on getting rid of those and reframing them. And it's normal to feel anxious. That's your body telling you that you really care about this.
Right.
But she did a really great job of reframing it and saying, okay, whenever those things come into my head, I'm going to let them dance on through and then focus on, right, I have steps I'm going to take on every single question I see. And that's where she tried to direct her energy, and it worked for her in the end.
I love, this is less of a question and more of an observation, but in both of the last 2 examples you've given, I feel like what you've described ultimately is like the students learning kind of a process, right? Like sort of a structured process for how to, in the previous case, like, I'm making a lot of careless mistakes. What are my steps that I need to, memorize here or internalize, right? I need to read the question twice. I should always at the end of the question, once I have the answer, I should, double check that it's the right answer. I should, when I'm doing certain kinds of arithmetic, I should double check my math. I mean, I don't know if it sounds like you were describing something similar with her, where she had to, the reason I'm observing it is that I think as a tutor, unless I'm not as good, I don't think, at being like, here exactly are the steps that you should, I'm a little bit more general in my suggestions and not like, okay, I want you to read the question twice every single time. And then I want you to do this. And then I want you to do that. But I think for some people, again, correct me if I'm wrong, if that's not exactly what was going on with her, but it seems like, I think for some people, that's what they need. They need a very specific set of process, a process with specific steps in it that they can replicate over and over.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't think it's necessarily the case that everybody needs to be really, not rigid is the wrong word, but have a really super systematic approach. Anybody with inconsistent results does need some sort of systematicness in their approach. I think anxiety or something like, Randy's very specific kind of manifestation of ADHD, they might need it more, and they might need something that's very tailored to them because it gives them something to focus on and execute on every single question, so that when those intrusive thoughts come into their minds, they've got something to kind of fixate on and say, no, let me let those thoughts pass through and just do this. But it doesn't need to be the case that that's what every student needs to do. I think some people can have a looser approach and be incredibly effective.
Yeah, I was going to ask if there's anything that you think is unique about her situation that maybe is less, it would be harder for people to replicate.
I think everything, so unique in the sense that her anxiety was so debilitating that it led to this score that was so incredibly low. Some of these stories, when we say, oh, somebody improved by 270 points or 400 points, some of the story is that initial score was really, really dramatically depressed by something, omitted questions, really bad anxiety. So it makes the score improvement look like something that it distorts what that looks like, right? Her skills didn't improve by 270 points, right? It was that her execution did, and that makes it different. I think what's a little bit funky about some of these stories is, there's something unique that pulls the score down, but almost everything we're talking about, it comes down to, is the student willing to be introspective and really deal with these issues that are freaking hard? I mean, this stuff is really difficult. Anxiety, retraining your brain to approach things differently when you have those intrusive thoughts, if you have ADHD or anxiety or whatever it might be. Extraordinary discipline in case of some of these students. I think all of those things are possible for anybody to do. You can always figure out what your problems are, approach them head on, and really work on them. The problem is it's freaking hard. And if you're on a timeline and you work full time, do you have the time to really do this? Like, is it important enough that you're going to really throw this much time and energy into completely overhauling the way your brain reacts to a test? That's something not everybody can realistically do. It's possible to do, but not everybody really has the time and bandwidth to do it.
I'm going to say something here that I'm probably going to regret saying, but I hate to say it, but I do think this is where tutoring can be helpful, because I think sometimes people just can't self-diagnose. You know what I mean? Like they're not able to see. So I think, it doesn't even necessarily mean that you need a ton of tutoring. And obviously many people don't need any tutoring at all. But I think that's part of what we have done over all these years, right? Is like, we meet people, we are able to diagnose their issues, not because we're geniuses, but just like we've done it so long, right? That like, it's not that hard to see what a person is doing that other people aren't doing, basically. What they're doing that's ineffective that people who are effective are doing differently. And it can be just genuinely hard, I think, when you're on your own prepping to understand the things. You don't have the vantage point to be able to understand what you're doing that's ineffective or different from what people who are really good, are doing. So I don't know. I think that's a tough one. Obviously that's, reading, GMAT Club, forum posts on how to approach questions and like, all that stuff helps. But probably some people need someone peeking over their shoulder a little bit, to maybe give them some guidance on on how they need to be doing things a little bit differently.
That's it for this episode of the Random Guest Podcast. If you enjoyed us, please hit that like button. Please hit the subscribe button. As always, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. Also available on the GMAT Club and GMAT Ninja YouTube channels. If you enjoyed today's guest, Brian Prestia, he is the founder of Reason Test Prep. You can find out more about him and his company at reasontestprep.com. And if you want to know more about me, you can find us and our new course at gmatninja.com. Thank you again for watching or listening, and have fun studying.